We're glad to have Professor Gregory Siegbert with us. Dr. Gregory Siegbert is a professor of communication studies in the Department of Communication and Theater. He has published widely in journals such as Cultural Studies, Architectural Design, and Culture Machine. Greg has distributed chapters to various books, including Deleuze Key Concepts, Animations of Deleuze and Guattari, and New Cultural Studies. And most recently, he has edited a collection of wonderful essays on affect and cultural theory in a book called The Affect Theory Reader, which you can see in the background, published by Duke University Press. And I guess to many people who want to venture into, wow, the book is there.
It's beside me at all times. I just know.
Yeah.
I'm working on something. I had to refer to it. So.
I guess it's like a Bible to anyone who wants to venture into affect theory, because it's a very carefully selected collection of essays. Okay. So thank you for being with us, Greg.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to meet you and have a little bit of a chat before we got started here. But
thank you. Same here. So to start with, affect is a notoriously difficult and elusive concept to define and compartmentalize. And many people who are into theories are usually obsessed with an idea of a definition or framework. And I guess that's something that with affect, it's very difficult to achieve. So in layman's terms, how do you describe the affect to the uninitiated?
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that that makes affect difficult is it's not one thing. In fact, it's not a thing, right? It's a process. It's a ongoingness. So that makes it hard in some ways to wrestle into language. Though in the affect theory reader, we describe affect most simply as the force of encounter or the encounter of forces. But I think that the thing that makes it difficult to talk about is that affect, for me at least, is at minimum three things at the same time. It's at once that encounter or that impingement, that point of contact in which some kind of intensity, some kind of feel, some kind of something shifts in the nature of your own understanding of the world, or reciprocally in the thing that you're encountering. So there's this moment of contact. At the same time, though, there's also this this moment of contact or this intensity arrives in the midst of an ongoingness. I mean, it's not as if the world just arrived in that moment of intensity or contact. There's something that's already been happening before and will carry on after. And so that idea of a kind of a gradient of positive or negative kind of intensities that encounter point locates itself within, what Spinoza via Deleuze calls a continuous line of variation, I think is important to also hold on to, so that this point of contact is not this isolated, rupture, that in fact affect is part of a kind of ongoingness or processuality. And so in layman's terms, or in Spinozan terms, Spinoza actually had two words for affect in his ethics: affectio, which got translated as affection and sometimes got read as emotion, and then affectus, which is what Deleuze called this continuous line of variation by which these things, these encounters, these forces that impinge upon us are part of a wider field of relationships, and a kind of contextual kind of moment of producibility that have the capacity to kind of gather those into one's own, if we talk about it in a human sense, that one's own sense of how they're entering and going about their day and around the world, their world. And then the third level, which really has got to do with like the impersonal part of affect, which is hardest to get to, but the way in which there's a kind of field or a context in which this line that you're tracing, this line that you're following, this encounter that you're having, is within a much bigger context of potential, right? Of potentiality, of possible things that could or could not have happened. And so to think about affect is, for me, one, to think about the point or moment of intensity; two, to think about the line of variation by which this intensity arrives; and three, the context or the kind of the capacious potential of what could happen in a wider set of relationships that are right around that moment. And so to do affect studies, I think, is to, in some ways, be able to hold all three of those kind of levels or modes or registers at once as you try to kind of unfold and find your way through whatever kind of example context you're trying to do. Is that layman's terms? I hope so.
Well, it's still very difficult, but I guess no layman would ever venture into affect.
Well, let's use an example if you don't mind. So one of the examples I've written about a little bit, I don't think I've published this, but I have a dachshund, right? And dachshunds are notoriously, they're smell hounds, right? Their nose is at the ground at all times. And so to walk my dog, the kind of intensities my dog encounters are very different, very close to the ground, very odoriferous in ways that I don't smell, or if I do smell, I don't want to be her close to. Whereas she very much wants to either eat them, roll in them, or something. And so when we walk, she's looking for these points of intensity that are very important to her. In fact, she spends all day on the sofa dreaming about the things she encountered this morning. So when we go back out this afternoon, and she'll encounter those things again. So that's a kind of point of intensity. And again, it's a silly example, but but as we walk, we compose a relationship. She can't walk on her own because she would run off after every smell and squirrel and everything. So I have to have her on a lead, and we try to compose a relationship as companion species that isn't just me dominating the walk. I'll gladly, for a great deal of the time, let her take me where she wants to go until she arrives at the thing she wants to roll on. Then I interrupt the walk. But we compose a line of variation. We walk very, this kind of the intensities that I feel, the things that I encounter and I see. Because I'm more sight oriented, I can often see a dog coming in the distance, and I want to swerve our dog away from that. So we compose this line of variation around a set of intensities. At the same time, we're walking across a park or around my neighborhood that has a whole set of potentialities that neither one of us maybe has encountered quite yet, or have encountered in some way, that could open up new possibilities. And so I always think of affect as being that point of intensity, a line of variation, and a plane of potential. So it's a point, a line, and a plane, all three of those at once, if you can account for those. And again, I think all affect studies work at least enters into one of those. Maybe it's a line of variation that gets you excited. Maybe it's a plane of potential. But one of those is where you begin, and eventually you work your way across those three modes or registers. But that's, for me, important.
That's a great example. It actually reminded me a few years ago, I was in TA in a course where it was about the history of lines. And one of the examples that somebody brought up, sorry?
Reading
Ingold, that's right, yeah. And somebody brought exactly the same example, that I've tried to diagram the path that my dog takes in the morning, and the path that I want to take. And there's there's always a conflict, but at the same time, I have to come to a kind of a consensus. Yeah.
Otherwise, but you compose, right? You compose this, and in affect, it's often called a worlding, right? It's Katie Stewart or others talk about this idea of worldings, but worldings are this composition of points of intensity, lines of variation, and the wider kind of context of capacious capacity or producibility that make those things possible. So again, it's simple, but it's a place to start.
Very good example. Thank you very much. And there's also this passage in your book, which I guess you have now kind of talked about, but I found it to be very poetical and lyrical, but at the same time, it reminded me of Deleuze's idea of territorialization and deterritorialization. That's where we talk about affect as enforcing intensity. It's about bodies, bindings and unbindings, becomings and unbecomings. And there seems to be this jarring disorientation, as you have put it in the book. So I guess if you would want to unpack that passage maybe. So how is it similar to the idea of territorialization and deterritorialization that Deleuze brings up?
I think it is. I'm definitely, my orientation is very much through Spinoza and Deleuze, though I want to be careful. One of the things where I'm working on a project now, a second volume of the Affect Theory Reader, indeed, that is going off to, at least the proposal and the abstracts are going off to Duke University Press later this month. But one of the things we're working on is the idea that this bifurcation that I helped, and Melissa Gregg and I kind of accidentally instantiated in cultural studies around Deleuze, Spinoza, Tompkins, Sedgwick, which was a kind of late addition to the intro where one of the reviewers said, "So why affect now? Like it's been around for a while. Why now?" And I said, "Well, there's these two essays that came out in I think 1995, Masumi's essay Autonomy of Affect, and then Eve Sedgwick and Adam Frank's piece on Tompkins, which really kind of were a watershed moment, I think. And but I don't know if anyone. I mean, I read them in 1995. I'm not sure everybody else did. Some people did, obviously, but that has become now this kind of split, and I think that's a mistake. I think there's lots of overlap. In fact, in the book itself, in the Affect Theory Reader, within the Australian context, especially the kind of affect theories of Sylvan Tompkins were quite prominent, and were often taught alongside Anna Gibbs and Elsbeth Probyn and others there in Australia. Whereas, as you know, Sedgwicki and Tompkins as they were, and there's no reason for the split. But what we were trying to do in that passage you're mentioning in the book was that at the time of the Affect Theory Reader in 2010, there was this kind of sense that affect was always a kind of liberatory or positive force. There was always, in some ways, it was the hidden potential of the body to disrupt, right? Again, this bifurcation, which I think, again, is a mistake. You know, that kind of mental, conceptual, conscious apparatus was always being undone by the more unruly actions of sensations and bodies. And if we could locate the ways in which affect was speaking to us in ways that were beneath consciousness, we would somehow be free of oppressions and the rest. And it was a nice romantic story about affect, but in fact, and even the story I told about my dog, any kind of encounter, any kind of, you know, line of variation is also going to have at least some mixity of, you know, more negative, more, so that movement, as you mentioned, of like deterritorialization and reterritorialization, it's happening at the same time. It doesn't mean that affect can't have moments where it's liberatory, but it also means just as often affect can be an oppressive force. It can be something that is participating in regimes of domination, right? And so one of the things that we're doing in the second volume of the Affect Theory Reader is we're really trying to reckon with, in a much more open way, things like critical race theory and Black studies and the idea of Afro-pessimism and some of the other things that I think are really important to account for in the study of affect, that have to do with the ways in which affect is not a magical kind of element that will add to our theory mix and it'll lead us all to a brilliant, beautiful future. There are ways in which we have to reckon with the ways in which affect is very much about, the rise of new authoritarianisms and the climate catastrophes, and all those things are also affective events and affective points of intensity that are not, positive or on the upward gradient of intensity.
It's a very interesting point you brought up, because I come into affect from mainly a literary background and literary criticism. And you're sure you've heard of Rita Felsky's book, Critique and Post-Critique. So when I read that book, and I'm sure she has been met with a lot of backlash as well, because she's trying to redirect the focus of cultural studies or literary studies to the text itself. And affect is one of the areas she's looking at. Affect and the revival of sentimentality, which has usually been usually brushed with a negative connotation. And but so when you read that book, or for some people read that book, they might think that affect is all about affection, as you mentioned, and love and nice things. Let's celebrate the beauty of this or aestheticism of this book. Whereas with a lot of thinkers such as Sarah Ahmed and Lauren Berlin, whom unfortunately passed away 2 weeks ago, when you read affect, it's actually a very politically engaged theory, which is really not about like celebrating the beauties of emotions. No. It's nothing like that.
No, it's a good example. I appreciate what I was excited when I first read Rita Felsky's kind of when she started down this path. The first book that I thought had moments of, but it's too, ultimately, you describe it well. I won't say anything more, but it's all positive kind of.
And I guess she's looking at it from that perspective because she's a literary scholar anyway, and she has to go back to the text of a novel or a poem. But for a lot of other thinkers, mainly the ones who are mainly into cultural studies or political theory or feminists, like Sarah Ahmed, it's nothing like that. And I was listening to one of your interviews about the book she wrote, The Promise of Happiness, and she said that my mother said, "Oh, finally a book about happiness." I said, "No, there's nothing happy about that book."
No. Yeah.
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 You actually kind of answered the next question that I had, which was kind of a trajectory of affect, because like I remember you also mentioned in one of your interviews that you don't agree with the term affective turn, because it's been around for a long time. I personally first thought that affect is a new thing starting in mid 1990s with Kosofsky's article. I think it was Paranoid Reading and Cybernetics Fault, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, but when you look at it, like you mentioned, Spinoza has talked about it, Freud and Tompkins, and I don't know much about Tompkins. So I was wondering if how is a Freudian idea or a psychoanalytic idea of affect different from what you or other thinkers in cultural studies have in mind when it comes to affect?
Well, I guess it's for me, and when I was writing my dissertation back in the 90s, which it's come out in pieces all over the place, but it didn't make a kind of book project. It was too scattered. But my longest chapter was on Freud, and my dissertation was on affect. And what I find in Freud, especially the early Freud, everything up until his 1900 book, Interpretation of Dreams, where he's looking at aphasia and he's looking at studies in hysteria, and especially his project for scientific psychology, he was really trying to understand, and he's working with, he's in these labs where he's dissecting frogs, and he's trying to understand the kind of material bases for what he sees as affect. In fact, he has, in Project for Scientific Psychology, he has this moment where he believes he's kind of discovered what he calls an affect machine. But the problem was it kept breaking down. He couldn't make it. But of course, as Deleuze and Guattari point out, the affect machine always breaks down. But he throws his book in the back of a drawer and hopes that the project, which is a massive book, Project for Scientific Psychology, hopes it will never see light of day. But when his students publish it and give it to him as a kind of honor, he gets quite angry. He wants to destroy all the copies that are out there. But it's a fascinating book because he's trying to understand what I think we're still wrestling with in certain domains of affect studies. I mean, Kate Hales in her book Unthought, and some other kind of work in neurology. I think Tony Sampson's one of the best people here. Steve Shaviro. We're trying to understand the relationship between conscious, unconscious, non-conscious, and how that works, not just as human, but as something that is also connects us to the kind of the broader kind of context and worlds in which we're a part. And Freud was doing that. I think Project for Scientific Psychology is not, the flawed book he thought it was. In fact, he goes back, I'm trying to remember, it's been a while since I've looked at this work, but he actually goes back and tries to change, it's in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he actually changes certain words that are much more material, like a material location for these things, which I think is really interesting to think about, and changes them to psyche. Like he wants to kind of escape that model of a kind of materialist model of the non-conscious, which I think is worth pursuing still. And again, I think there are people who are trying to do that. And I think affect is obviously one of the ways in which we can better understand, because even though Spinoza says we don't yet know what a body can do, I'm not convinced we quite yet know what a conscious mind can do and where it goes. Like what is it? So, the kind of extended mind hypothesis of people like Andy Clark and others that say, whatever we consider the contents of our mental activities and we locate it in our head, chances are there are all kinds of scaffolds and proppings that we are using throughout the day, whether it's this pen that I use to write a note to myself on a piece of paper, whether it's that Google search I did, whether it's the notes I underlined in a book, whether it's the walk I had with my dog and that thought I had that wouldn't have only happened because I was walking the dog. All those encounters aren't located here, right? They're as much in the space around us that we carry alongside of us. That has to be accounted as affective, and those are material things, right? So the idea of I always like to use with my students when I talk about affect, Bergson's idea of involuntary memory, right? That we have all these things we can do, and all these encounters we have that get deposited somewhere in our, and it's not just reflex, it's not just kind of gestural memory. I mean, if you could go back to the house you grew up in and to look out a window, you could just like, Proust, who was a student of Bergson's, who writes in remembers of things, or In Search of a Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past. This encounter, right, which is there, but it's not located just in you. It's you and the object world and the processual nature of that that is part of your own kind of scaffolding. And that to me is an affectively material relationship. And so that's, I think that's really important to try to get. And I think Freud was one of the first to really try to do that in a scientific way. And I think, again, one of the kind of bifurcations that happen in affect studies sometimes is a kind of, and often gets criticized. There's this great essay called Biology's Gift that by two British researchers. That's really good. That says, affect often relies on scientific research, but then doesn't quite, and I think it's got some points it makes. But people like Lisa Blackman and others are saying there's work going on in the sciences that affect has a lot to say about. And there's ways in which the science, the different kind of brain sciences and other kinds of sciences are clearly doing things that are experimental and are speculative and are verging into, the kind of philosophical realm that affect is often seen to dwell in. We need to find ways in which we can bring that together more and more.
Thank you. I didn't know that story about Freud. I'm going to check the book as well. So the book is published now, right?
Yeah, Project for Scientific Psychology. Yeah, as much as Freud didn't want it to be published. Yeah, and there's this great moment. I actually have an essay. It's in the Animations of Deleuze and Guattari book that you mentioned in the intro on this moment in Freud. So I can send it to you if you want.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah. Thank you very much. Now you've given me something to read after the interview. Interesting point you mentioned about Freud trying to work with this model of affect as a material entity, but you couldn't, or you put it away. I think that's all what Brian Massumi is putting a lot of emphasis on, which is affect is about skin, it's about our bodies, and in cultural studies we don't have a vocabulary specific to that to describe that. He mentions it in that book, and autonomy of affect. Yeah. And that's another question that I also had. Brian Massumi is very careful to make a distinction between affect and emotion. And he just mentioned that Spinoza has two words for affect, and one of them is affection. So it's sometimes affect and emotions are used synonymously. Yeah. But do you do you distinguish these two from one another, or?
Well, again, if we think about those modes that I talked about, there's three modes you have to kind of register, you have to hold together: the point of intensity, the line of variation, the plane of potential. That I think that people who work most commonly in that kind of point of intensity, that verges on something very close to emotion. We can call it emotion. I think when we talk about lines of variation, we talk about planes of potential, it's hard to think about those as emotion. And those increasingly become less and less human. I think the problem with, and again, I can think about animal emotion. I think Franz de Waal's work on animals and emotion is really important work to think about. But I think but if we reduce affect just to emotion, then that's a problem. But I want to say it's emotion and something more than emotion. But I have no problem. There's this really interesting writer named Daniel Stern, who wrote a book called The Interpersonal World of the Infant. It deals a lot with affect. He talks about what he calls categorical and vitality affects. And vitality affects are the idea that these things are always passages of intensity. They're always the hand that is moving towards the child to pick the child up. It's always moving. It's always this. So it's hard to rope it off and say that's care or that's love. I mean, this is an action that is a material action, but also something is something more than emotion. But he says, besides vitality effects, which are all the kind of joys and rushes and sadnesses that we are hard to kind of give a discrete name to, he talks about categorical affects, which are the kind of describable affects that have the kind of easy terms that we can put on, not necessarily easy terms, but the terms that we can think about in more emotional context. But I always want to say that those things are always being preceded by and following in the wake of, some other larger, instead of something already in motion. So I don't want to lose track of the motions that attend to how emotions arrive, right? And that's important, I think. But the big debate about if it is a big debate about emotion and affect, I don't want to make it a big debate. I think emotion has a place in affect studies.
It seems that some later thinkers like Sarah Ahmed tends to use them in some cases interchangeably.
Yeah, but again, you think about what Sarah does, the kind of phenomenology.
Yeah.
That is, even though she queers phenomenology, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that is, again, working in that register of intensities and how things, register, on or across the skin of a body or about, and that is, I think it gets you really close to affections and emotions in that earlier kind of mode.
Not that I mentioned Sarah Ahmed, I'd like to talk about her a little bit, just because I was reading her books. I think it was called The Political Economy of Emotions, where she talks about emotions. And I think it's very relevant. She wrote it, I guess, in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of years after 9/11. But I guess it's very relevant these days as well, because she talks about how emotions could serve as a basis for formation of groups, local groups or movements. Emotions such as anger, hatred, love, and I guess with recent movements, anti-racist movements such as Black Lives Matters, or even some white supremacist groups also use those emotions as a basis of formation. So I guess that's an important moment, because then emotions are not something internal, but they become, that intensity that you just mentioned, and there are lines of movements again in society that we can see. So
she says it's really important to say, you've probably read it too, and I'm going to blank on the name exactly, but basically the circulation of affective economies or values, and the way in which, the way in which affect or emotion, and the way in which Sarah Ahmed understands it, it's not this kind of, it's kind of like a capital, like capital doesn't work if it just sits. Capital has to move and has to kind of, enter, go out into the world and return with something a little extra. Usually you hope it's a bigger capitalist profit. But she talks about the way in which affect or emotion circulate, and the kind of value economies that accrue to the ways in which those circulate, and the communities in which those circulate, what Laurent Boulant calls the magnetization, right? Like this idea of the kind of ways in which certain kinds of affective values create these magnets that draw people. And I think that, again, even work like Tony Sampson's most recent book on Sleepwalker's Guide to Social Media, this looks at the rise of new authoritarianisms and the kind of new fascisms that are happening around the world. He looks at Bolsonaro, and he looks at Trump, obviously, and looks there in England at but there's the rise of those figures and what kind of emotions circulate. And again, the famous moment from Trump was the sign that a follower held up that said, "Fuck your feelings," right? Like this is, and this is kind of, that's a kind of very intense statement itself about feelings, that draw kind of, the way in which that affective value circulates, and either draw people or repel, just like a magnet does, or the poles of something that send some particles over there and some over here, and we can see this happening in the world increasingly as things get more and more, at least in the U.S. especially, under Trump, more and more polarized.
Yeah, I guess.
But I think Sarah Ahmed's work is fantastic on
that. I think with the recent, with the epidemic that we are in, and again, some people trying to scapegoat others for the outbreak of the epidemic. That's, again, I guess, very much relevant to the idea of affect and how it's used as this intensity or emotion is used as a political weapon.
Right. You can see it happening not just, at the level of a population, but at the level of at the ways in which what circulates around them, whether it's the food they eat, or whether it's the places they worship, or the things that they hold as valuable, then also get sucked into that orbit of, either things to be attracted to or repulsed by. So it's that is very much affective, right? That kind of transversality of different forms of how affect travels in ways that can link processes, objects, and environments.
Thank you very much. And just as a last question, in your book, you lay out 8 different approaches towards affect, and you do talk about Bruno Latour as well. And remember, I read somewhere that I personally love the works of Bruno Latour, but he has also been met with backlash. And one of them is that he comes up with these esoteric ideas of giving vitality or life to objects. But I do find his ideas very interesting because it does break down, it does collapse that Cartesian duality of subject, object, human, non-human, and it makes us think of agency as a form of a distributed agency or a network of agencies, which is again very similar to the idea of affect, those lines or points of intensities. Mm-hmm. So is it also something?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Latour that I really appreciate. I think that you're exactly right. What I like most about his work is the idea of distributed agency, the idea of the non-human, and in his case, often the technological, as having its own kind of agency. But I, the way in which I often talk about his work in my classes is there's a great book. It's a really popular book. It's sold pretty well. Michael Pollan, a book called The Botany of Desire, where he looks at four plants: the apple, marijuana, potato, and the tulip. But he wants to know how they are agents. And so here in America, of course, we have this idea that it's as American as apple pie. But when you read his chapter on the apple, you find out there were no apples in America, right? They're from, they're from the kind of, I forget the exact location, but somewhere like in the kind of corners of Russia in the mountains there. And they traveled here. I mean, people like Johnny Appleseed and others spent all their time kind of redistributing apples to open up the American frontier. But apples don't grow sweet from the ground; they need to be grafted. So the apple really kind of guides us. It, in some ways, requires us to do the labor that produce, the apple that we eat. But the idea that this American phenomenon was something that we just simply, were the agents of. When in fact, if anything, the apple had a great capacity to in some ways lead to its own kind of thriving. That's, and I think Latour does something similar when he looks at the ways in which the agency of non-human objects and processes have just as much capacity to affect as they have to be affected, and remind humans that we are not at the center of that world. And I think there is some danger, as you mentioned, the kind of giving vitality. I think it's often a critique of Jane Bennett and what Alexander Galloway has called in affect studies nature's largesse, right? Like there's this kind of idea that these things just are already vital, and we just kind of unlock that vitality. And there's something very romantic about that. And there's something that's, that is probably, again, we don't want to modulate any kind of, full. I think affect is always about mixities. It's never about being positive or wholly negative. It's always some kind of potential to affect and to be affected. It may not be reciprocal, it may not be equal, but it's hard to grant it all one or the other. And I think Latour certainly makes you rethink the ways in which you center the human and build out from there. You can't, in Latour's work, you can't put the human at the middle. And so there's great work. Like I think one of the best books of the last 15 years or so is Natasha Dow Scholl's book on machine gambling in Las Vegas, in which she really does, and she uses Latour amongst others, talk about the assemblage of the machine, the human, the algorithm, the architecture of the casino, the angle of light, that all produce this kind of gambling affect. And it's really sophisticated in terms of how the human is not the center of the story, right? How it gets feathered out into technologies and other things. So I think Latour's, I certainly credit his work with kind of making that available to critical vocabulary to think with.
When I wanted to get my head around the idea of assemblage, I guess one of the best examples that I read was the famous blackout, I think in New York, that affected hundreds of thousands of people. And the idea of distributed agency, that nobody planned a fault into the machine. It was a work of the machines and the cables, the humans and the computer and the codes and algorithms. So that's how I tend to think of the idea of an assemblage network and distributed agency.
Yeah.
Just had we enough time and will to continue this conversation. Thank you very much, Gregory. That was an excellent conversation, and it's certainly given me a long list of books to have a look at after the interview.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure to talk to you this morning, and I hope some of it connects and makes sense. And I know you're going to share this with some students that you're working with, or community you're working with. So that's fantastic. And if they have questions, anybody wants to follow up, I'm available. I'm busy, but I'm always willing to
Wonderful.
help. Particularly, that's one of the things I try to do in affect studies is that through the journal Capacious and through events and seminars and workshops, I really do want to reach out to early career scholars, to non-academics, and to graduate students. That's really where I find the energy and the vitality of the academy and whatever kind of hopefulness I have, which there isn't a great deal of that anymore for the academic futures, is in the young people who are challenging the ways in which we think the theories and the world operates. And so I'm always happy to have dialogue with people who are working and trying to figure things out.
Thank you very much. With your permission, then I'll pass your email to the students. So if they have any questions, they can just contact you directly. Thank you very much. And I'll send you the video before uploading it on YouTube.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.